I'm going to start this video by asking you how much of your life you spend occupied with storytelling. This could be reading a book on the bus on the way to work, sharing anecdotes with your mates over coffee, or that time we all spend at the end of the day to catch up on our favourite TV show. When you think about it, storytelling makes up a massive part of our day-to-day lives. But why? The fact that we feel an urge to tell stories and a desire to hear them leads us to think that it is an evolved psychological tool of sorts and therefore must exist for a reason. But what about fictional stories? Surely stories which talk about people that don't even exist can't be said to benefit our reproductive fitness, which is the primary factor of change in natural selection. And as I make my way through this video, I'm going to try and convince you all of just that. Although an interest in non-fictional storytelling can be easily explained by evolutionary theory, fictional storytelling, I will argue, is little more than a spandrel, a term that in evolutionary biology describes the otherwise unintended byproduct of evolutionary adaptations. This video is going to be split into two sections. One to talk about the evolutionary origins of storytelling, and the second to argue why I think fictional storytelling is a spandrel. So, what exactly is storytelling? Simply put, storytelling is something of a social activity involving a storyteller and a number of listeners. Examples of storytelling might include dinner-time conversation, in which the storyteller is constantly changing as the conversation moves from topic to topic, or it could be less active, say I'm reading the biography of my favourite celebrity. If we consider storytelling to be an evolved trait, it seems to appear in two kinds. They're the desire to share stories and the desire to listen to them. Separate as they are, these traits critically depend on one another in their use, because to share a story, one requires active listeners, and likewise, to listen to a story, one requires a storyteller. For both of these, if we want to figure out why they are evolved adaptations, we need to look at their function in a society and see how this function relates to reproductive fitness, the primary factor of change in natural selection. In her essay on the origins of narrative, storytelling bias as a fitness-enhancing strategy, Michelle Sugiyama cites this telling of stories as a kind of social intelligence, way more complex than you might at first think. And what is social intelligence, I hear you ask? Well, it's a name for adaptations which took place in response to humans deciding to live in groups rather than by themselves, which happened some 11,000 to 2.5 million years ago during the Pleistocene. Having social intelligence means that a person is genetically more predisposed to successfully navigate their social environment, which might include being able to communicate more freely or picking up on unspoken social cues, all of which, during the Pleistocene, will have greatly benefited a person's reproductive fitness. Storytelling helps us function socially, according to Sugiyama, by allowing people to inject their bias into the telling of a story. And by doing this, it will affect the way in which the story is received, in order to better align with the interests of the storyteller. Politicians are a pretty clear example of storytelling bias in their retelling of societal events, in which they'll use hand gesturing, tone of voice, interjections, and facial expression in order to convince the audience of their particular take on an issue. Through use of these tools, the storyteller is able to affect the manner in which their story is received, consciously or unconsciously manipulating the audience to suit their fitness interests. Now, this seems all well and good, but it seems to rely on an already present desire for the audience to consume stories. To explain this, I'd like to suggest another facet of social intelligence which, rather than incentivizing people to be active in social exchanges, encourages the collection of shared information so as to increase one's awareness of the many influencing factors within their particular community. This might include being aware of potential risks, perhaps the village drinking water has become contaminated, or favourable opportunities, say there's a grove of edible berries nearby. Jerome Barco describes this kind of social intelligence as the product of natural selection for success in social competition, carrying with it the ability to predict and influence the behaviour of potential rivals for resources, present and potential allies, possible mates, and of course, close kin. So basically, our boy Barco is saying that the reason for us wanting to gossip with each other is because it helps us to get the best mental picture of the important people in our lives. To put this in perspective, these people might include family members, relatives, members of the opposite sex, people in positions of authority or power, rivals, offspring, etc. Really just the people who are most likely to affect the reproductive fitness of our ancestors during the Pleistocene. So, imagine I'm Fred Flintstone and I want to find somebody to help me sort out a big pile of food that I have collected for the upcoming winter. Do I choose Barney Rubble, a stand-up citizen and someone who I've only ever heard good things about, or do I choose Cliff Vandercave, executive vice president of Slate & Co and someone who's gossiped to be a bit of an embezzler? Well, of course I'm going to want to choose Barney, because I know that the chances of him running off with my food are much lower. This is because I have a mental picture of him as a trustworthy person, created by the praise that I hear about him in conversations. If I wasn't able to create this picture in my head, the chances of me choosing Cliff, having my food stolen, and then starving through the winter would be comparatively a lot higher. From this, it's easy to see the reproductive benefit that the collection of social information has, and why we might find ourselves paying attention to stories, a rich source of social information. If we relate this now to storytelling, it's easy to see how the two complement each other. On one hand, you have the storyteller who's in a perfect position to implement their bias, their take on the story, which is communicated through the way it is told, and is used to promote the fitness interests of the storyteller. And on the other hand, you have audience members, those whose fitness interests are to gain as much knowledge about the various social factors in play around them as possible. So far, this seems like a plausible account for our interest in storytelling. But how does this interest explain our fascination with fictional stories? After all, an interest in fictional people can't be seen to benefit our reproductive fitness in the ways that I have already discussed, since fictional people are not actual members of our own community. This is, I argue, because fictional stories are spandrels, triggering the same psychophysical cues as we would otherwise encounter during the Pleistocene. The stories by themselves do not serve any ordained purpose, for they are not fitness enhancing as would be in the case of regular social information. We might think of the communicated information in these social exchanges as quasi-social information, a useless imitation of actual social information. Jerome Barco argues this point as it relates to our fascination with strangers, people whose lives we have an interest in, though to no obvious evolutionary advantage. He argues that quasi-social information, such as the kind one obtains while obsessing over the exploits of celebrities, is obtained in such a way so as to exploit our evolved need to create internal representations of people around us. Imagine, for example, that during the Pleistocene our ancestors had access to the television and decided to watch Keeping Up with the Pleistocene Kardashians. In this case, we can imagine that there would have been a selection pressure for their brains to be able to differentiate between genuine members of their community and non-members who have no actual impact on their lives. And if such an adaptation had evolved to make this distinction, it seems unlikely that we would nowadays care so much for the lives of Jaden Smith, Miley Cyrus, Kim Kardashian, or indeed any other character of the sort. However, since there wasn't any such adaptation, our brains were never pressured to be able to differentiate between real and fake social information. It's the newness of outer group communication in human culture, to the extent that we're able to learn about the exploits of non-community members, which justifies our lack of such an adaptation. Relating this argument to non-existent people, we might say the same for particular fictional characters. Tyrion Lannister, for example, is a person whose life exploits millions of people follow, yet he also happens not to exist. Just as in the case of celebrities, an interest in Tyrion Lannister doesn't directly affect our inclusive fitness, and again, just as in the case of celebrities, we do not care and continue to obsess over him without regard to this fact. For the same reasons that our brains mistake celebrities for genuine community members, they do so for non-existent people. It's also important to say that it's not like we're unaware of ourselves when we find ourselves insensibly obsessed with fiction. Barker remarks that although we might find our obsessions embarrassing, our knowledge of the pointlessness of this behaviour is more likely to lead us to mask it rather than alter it. He draws comparison between this and other forms of sense exploitation. Junk food, for example. Our taste palette evolved to place what were at the time scarce and valuable nutrients above those which were plentiful, constituents of which include salt, sugar, and fat. While this might have been incredibly useful during the Pleistocene, nowadays it seems only to achieve the adverse effect. Ironically, the overabundance of these three nutrients now pose a great risk to reproductive fitness. Another such example might be the use of sexual imagery, whether as a mere means of drawing attention to an advertising ploy, or just for the imagery itself, as one might encounter in the case of pornography. It seems ridiculous when you consider how much time, effort and money is put into something that has very little impact on reproductive fitness, but it is at the very least understandable when you consider the usefulness of sexual interest during the Pleistocene. And just like our interest in fiction, merely being aware of not only the pointlessness, but potential danger of our habits isn't always enough to change them. In short, Barco says, Pleistocene adaptations can lead to profits. Thanks for watching this video. If you have any questions or comments, chuck them below and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. A huge thanks to Doug Campbell and Richard Tweedy for helping me on this project, along with the rest of Richard's class for their feedback on my presenting ability. I also want to thank the Philosophy Tube YouTube channel, the Thunk YouTube channel, and the Philosophize This podcast for inspiration on this project. I'll chuck the links down in the description below.